Welcome again to the Campfire Project, and today we've got another great panel ahead for you. We're covering the globe today. First of all, we've got Henry Johnstone up there in London. How are you, Henry?
I'm good, mate. I'm good. It is a little bit earlier than my usual rising time, but I'm powering through. But I am very well, thank you.
Fantastic. And then we've got Thomas Hewlett from LA. How are you, Thomas?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
And then over in Australia, down in Melbourne, we've got Michael Lauria. So how are you, Michael?
Awesome, Alan. Thank you. Very well.
Well, this is really great because it's an interesting subject we got today. And this is one that, Henry, you brought up for us, which was porn, what messages are being sent to our boys in terms of healthy relationships, sexual expectations, intimacy, love and respect. And I've been looking forward to having a chat with all three of you to get a sort of a global view on it as well and how things vary. But what I'd love, Henry, if you wouldn't mind, to kick us off, because this was something that you were quite passionate about.
Yeah, sure. So the reason why I wanted to discuss this is because when I grew up, there was no internet. There were kind of lingerie magazines, and that was how I got my fix for all intents and purposes. And I was a young kid, you know, and I grew up, and I didn't have a great knowledge about sex or relationships, but it was fairly balanced because my only term of reference was my brothers and my parents, you know, and they had a healthy relationship. So I went on to life thinking, this is what a relationship looks like. Now, with the way that porn has just exploded onto the internet, there is a massive amount of information all based around sex. And what I'm concerned about is what kind of message it's sending to young boys who, instead of looking to their parents or to people in their family for what a relationship looks like, they're now looking to this stuff on the internet. And the really worrying thing is that porn on the internet revolves around abuse. You know, if you look at Pornhub's most searched things, it's horrible. It's something like stepdad and daughter sex, you know, and I just don't know what kind of message that's sending to our boys, that this is acceptable, and like the kind of sex that they're having, you know, this abusive, quite raw, quite intense, very aggressive, violent. Is that a good message for a young boy, you know, to say this is what a sexual relationship looks like?
Yeah, well, especially when they're not given a reference to work it out. All they're getting is those examples, and then not knowing what the norm is and what's acceptable, and therefore not knowing whether they're doing the right or wrong thing, and the impact that has on the girl. How about over there in the States, Thomas? What have you found?
Well, I find that it's, you know, since Henry brought this up, I've been asking the guys I work with, the various men's groups, kind of get some feedback. And I find that it's kind of a shifting baseline. You bring up like no standard of normalcy anymore. And I think if you're young and impressionable, puberty, post-puberty, and even into your 20s, I think this is now a snowballing effect of what is normal keeps shifting and shifting. And I find that talking to guys, this seems to have a ripple effect. You could probably draw a straight line from internet porn to sexual abuse, to rape, to any number of situations and scenarios where guys now think abuse, as Henry said, and sexually aggressiveness is acceptable. I think it's kind of just it seems to be this like a ripple effect. It's kind of hitting all areas of these guys' life. And, you know, I think too, the idea that this all starts with something that is secret, not talked about and not embraced in a healthy way in society. It's not like porn is like an everyday mainstream thing. And when we talk about it, it's not a healthy thing. And I think everyone knows that. And this is now the kernel of their sexual identity. It's secret, shameful, something is wrong, but no one talks about it. No one knows why. It must be so confusing.
And that's exactly right. What were your thoughts on it, Michael?
Yeah, look, I'm a relationship coach, in case you guys didn't know. So what I see and hear a lot in, and a men's mentor as well, but what I see a lot in relationships is that when people are unsatisfied in relationships, when men are unsatisfied primarily in relationships, what they will do is they will then turn to internet pornography to fill some kind of a void. And then when they see, when they see some of the images that are portrayed in internet pornography, it then triggers that really reptilian, mammalian part of our brain, and that leads to very, very even more unhealthy expectations within an already unhealthy and disconnected relationship. So when they then go to their partner looking for sex, it's usually in a very unhealthy way because of what they've seen in pornography on the internet. So I believe that pornography is very damaging, particularly in relationships. Definitely how it is influencing the thoughts and image that a young person, a young boy, might have surrounding sex and intimacy and connection. Because one of the things these are the things that are actually missing in internet porn. When you observe someone in that environment on the internet, it's really about, usually, it's about the man conquering the woman. It's some sort of conquest. And so there's no intimacy and there's no connection. And so this is why we're seeing a rise in violence. I believe, I agree with both of the other guys. I see an increase in violence, in sexual crime, and I also believe it's directly related to internet porn and this addiction that a lot of people have.
I feel like... Sorry, Alan, go on.
Yeah, I heard recently that in Holland, I think it is, they were actually showing boys in particular in their sex education, people having sex. When I first heard that, I thought, what? And then I heard what they were actually doing was only showing from the neck up. So you didn't see the body. And I thought, why are they doing that? And it dawned on me. It's the expressions that you see on the porn from the women, and the boys think that that's normal. So what they were trying to do now was show them what the expressions are like in a loving relationship, where the woman's enjoying what they're going through. So the boys understood what was right and what was wrong. Because
also around healthy expectations. Also around healthy expectations too, because in internet porn we see everyone's always having a good time and everyone's just orgasming repeatedly. And so young people bring that into they have that in their field of expectation. So then when they have sex with a girl, or when they're a man and they have sex with a woman, if that woman isn't making a ridiculous amount of noise and orgasming multiple times in 5 minutes, they then attach some sense of failure to themselves or inadequacy as a boy or a man, because they can't make a woman orgasm that much and so aggressively. And so it's really about setting these expectations, and pornography sets these unrealistic expectations, because we all know as grown men that it just isn't like that all the time.
That's it. What were you going to say, Henry?
I think we touched on something really interesting. It's the objectification of women, and we're very much talking about there are some porn producers who their niche is, loving more realistic pornography. I think that's quite interesting that they're doing that. But the vast majority of it is the women are objectified, and as Michael said, when you have that in a relationship, men will go looking for sex, but they will objectify the woman. They'll remove her wants, her feelings, any respect for her. They see her as a vessel to get this animalistic. And I think this animalistic kind of urge out from them, which is something that the bad porn really promotes. It's this objectification, this using of a woman. And then I think of young boys who have been watching a lot of porn, and they're going into schools, and that whole learning process of getting over your shyness to be with a woman, getting your first girlfriend. It's kind of that wonderful naivety and this wonderful gift of growth when we learn how to communicate is just totally removed, because the woman has become an object, a vessel to be and she will be submissive. And then there's also something Michael said, if the guy can't get an erection, the guy doesn't have a massive penis, there's all this shame that's put on him. And if we're not talking about it, then how can we even begin to counteract all these negative expectations which are being put on our boys?
And that's the real issue, and that it's not just the alignment of what they're being told and everything else, but it's the expectations of what they think they're supposed to be about and how that actually impacts on them. We've got enough trouble with the boys understanding where their roles are. In schools, we have very few men in the early years teaching. We've got, with a number of divorces, there's almost, but not quite 50% of families don't have a male in there. And so the boys are quite open to anything that comes along in this particular way. Nobody's explaining anything to them. And so they've got this expectation. And then from that expectation, now because they've got all these beliefs that this is what they're supposed to be like themselves, and they don't measure up to that. And so now they're going, well, you've actually put another problem on. Not only they're not making it sexually, but now emotionally they're crippled as well.
Yeah.
So that causes a real problem.
I think Henry made a very good point in regards to the objectification of women, because when we look at that in the context of intimacy, aside from the very rare occasion where you have pornography, which demonstrates a couple being intimate with each other as opposed to just having violent, aggressive sex, there's a massive disconnect there with the message that we're allowing people to see, I guess, for being able to make this porn available to everybody. Really, it's available to everyone of any age, anywhere in the world, mostly. And when we see this objectification of women, it takes away the need, it takes away the need for a boy then to expect or want some form of closeness, connectedness, and intimacy with a woman. And these are the real foundations of a strong, healthy relationship, that connectedness and that real closeness and intimacy, and that feeling of actually making love to a woman and making love together in that sexual capacity. And that's just missing in pornography. And when we don't have that connection and it's just about sex, is it any wonder that young boys are just becoming more and more aggressive and violent, and their expectations are unrealistic in this regard as well. So we talk about, then we go into areas of toxic masculinity and unhealthy masculinity. And these are parts of the reasons why, is because, women are being objectified to such a point. These women in pornography are allowing themselves to become objectified. Let's not forget that they're choosing to be there too. But one of the things here is how that is being represented, and how that's internalizing, how young boys and men are internalizing that when they're not in a very unhealthy state to begin with. When they're not in a very healthy state to begin with.
That's it. And so it's being able to understand, how do we actually guide them through, if we've got boys that are growing up, they haven't got men around them, and men don't really talk about intimacy that they're having themselves with somebody, not in a blow-by-blow description of what the act is like, but talking to a boy about intimacy and what that really feels like, that feeling of belonging. Because we know that as human beings, we need to be loved, we need to be valued, and we need to know that we're giving a contribution. So the pornography is taking all those things away from us. We're no longer connected to the woman, so there's no connection there, so there's no love. There's no feeling of real achievement, because what are we actually doing? We're living up to someone else's standard, which is an impossible standard. It's a ridiculous one. And so we're not meeting those basic needs that we've got. So we're creating not just a sexual expectation, but an emotional impact that is causing even further problems again. So I know back in, my oldest boy now is 40, when he was about 17, 18, at the school that he went to, there was a father whose daughter had been raped at school by some youths. And so one of his mates said, instead of getting angry, why don't you go in and start educating? So they started a program called Fathers Against Rape. And these fathers and that would go into the school and invite other fathers in, and they would have the boys in a room and they'd take them through scenarios. Now, when we went into it, and the funny thing was, there were only, not funny, but really a drastic thing, there were only 2 fathers from the Newcastle High that actually went in. It was me and one other guy. But we weren't allowed to go into the same room as our boys, so we went in with other boys. So the boys, our sons wouldn't feel intimidated or anything with us in the room. And they took them through a scenario and they'd ask them a question, and the stuff that was coming back, and this is, over 20 years ago now, 22 years ago, 23 years ago, the boys were coming through with some really ridiculous comments of what they believed and what they thought. And then they would say, well, if that's the case, then what about this? So they ran it like a hypothetical. And I watched these boys reasoning it out for themselves. And as the period of time went on, the class and that, we saw these boys grow from being small boys into young men. They actually looked taller when we finished, because that process, that involvement with other men, talking about intimacy and everything and asking questions, not telling them they were right or wrong, but having that discussion allowed those boys to work it out for themselves and go, Now, the thing is that gets me, that was 22 years ago. We've got porn today. We've had this problem for a very, very long time. So how do we go about, as fathers and as coaches for other men and everything else, how do we get the message out to the youth?
Yeah, it's a big question, Alan, isn't it? It's a big question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. I mean, the easy solution is to somehow ban internet porn, but that's never going to happen because the porn industry just makes ridiculous amounts of money. Yeah, look, it comes down to education, doesn't it? It just comes down to more intentional, purposeful education for boys and also for men. So people out there that are working with men, it's very important to have that education at a very high level to understand what intimacy actually looks like and how these things, when we come at this with a very high level of respect for ourselves and for women, which is really what we're talking about here. It's about having a high level of respect and awareness surrounding ourselves, where we're finding that connection, how we're finding that connection, and are we doing so in healthy ways, and how are we treating women in the process of doing that? Right, because that's one of the key things here. How are many men who are addicted, because it then becomes an addiction from an emotional perspective, how are we, not just as sort of Henry was saying, objectifying women, but then that's objectifying women online. What then happens when those people, those same men, go out in public and they're walking the streets, and they then see a good-looking woman? What's happening in their minds based on what they've just seen on their computer?
I think we can. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, Henry. No, please.
Yeah, Henry.
I think there's so many things there. If we look at it from like a porn mindset, if you see someone walking down the street, I'd bet my bottom dollar that, yeah, there'd be objectification, but there would also be a level of anger towards that woman, because in porn, that's used a lot when they call them bitch, whore, slut. All of that is really common uses of what used towards women. So I think like actually young men, and this is so interesting, when young men are growing up, they're looking for an identity. They're looking for the answers to all of this shit that's going on inside them, and they're receiving this message that if you're confused and you're a little bit angry, then you can project that onto a woman. That's where the disrespect comes from. But I also think that porn exists. I think that it is a good thing. Now, hear me out on this, is that we can have conversations with boys and we can use porn as a reflective point. Like, this is not how it is. But I can tell you a very human perspective of this is how it was for me, and then talk about the awkwardness of it, the struggle of it, the weird expectations that we have, and how ridiculous this expectation of porn is, because it's just complete fantasy land. And then explain to them that the reason why it's so successful is because they're preying on your insecurities. You want to be this, you want to do that. This is what amazing sex looks like, and every single human being on the planet thinks about sex constantly. So it's an easy direction for them to go in to find the answers that they've been looking for. But as to be fathers, and as friends, we can bring that much needed balance of like, I can tell you exactly what it's like, and this is it.
Yeah, I think as you said, with the porn and that, if you look at it and say, well, okay, instead of trying to ban it, because they're going to find a way through, as you said, Michael, they'll always be there. There's too much money involved for them not to be. So how do we then use it? As you've said, Henry has been able to use that and use as an example of what not to do and talk to the boys about what you should do. And also then help them to realise that, hey, this is another reason why you've got other emotional stuff going on, because that's the demands this pornography is putting on you, that's making you feel inferior and inadequate and everything else. What other things in life, other people's treatments, the way they behave and everything else, that do a similar thing to you on another level.
Yeah.
So whenever we look at anything, one of the things I've realised that we so often look at something and go, that's wrong, so then we go, okay, we've got to get rid of it. Everything's got an upside and a downside if we find it. And how do we actually then take that pornography, present it to the boys in a way in which, we take away the smut side of it, we take away the giggling and all the stupidity that goes with it, but have a serious conversation where they come out the other side going, wow, that's not what I want, but now I understand what a relationship should be like, and that's what I'm going to move towards.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree to a point. I feel like if that's going to be part of an educational, it should be a part of a fuller educational program surrounding what is a healthy relationship, what is respectful sex, right? I think that's an important part of it as well. What goes into the territory of objectifying a woman, and I think girls need to be part of this discussion too, not just boys, because girls have the same access as boys to internet porn. And I wonder what young girls feel and think when they see women putting themselves in these positions. I don't mean that in any other way except for putting themselves in a position where they're being filmed in situations like that. And I wonder what that does internally to a girl who thinks, is that how I need to get validation from men? Is that how I need to feel good about myself? Is that what I need to do? Is that the lengths that I need to go to in order for somebody to take notice of me? And so, because, those formative young teenage prepubescent years are the most influential on children and on young teenagers. And it's there where they will start to form values and beliefs and mindsets that will then either guide them through life in a healthy way or an unhealthy way. And so, yes, Henry, I believe that education is important, and maybe porn, used in the context of this is what not to do and this is what's really not good is good. I think that's good if used in a very controlled and healthy way.
That's it, and taking it, as you said, to that greater level and expand on it. So it's not, because I know when I was at school we had sex education, and our teacher was nervous, we were nervous and everything else, and it wasn't organised in a proper way. It didn't have people who knew how to explain things, and to be able to keep that serious focus on it, or that compassionate focus on it, so that it guided us through. So it's, this problem goes back a very long time, but what we have there today is a lot easier to access. It's having a greater impact. But yes, it needs to look at the women being involved or the girls being involved as well, because if that's what they see and they think that's what all the guys are looking for, then how many of them who want to try and fit in put themselves in that same position and then go through and then go, right, now I've been abused, and that affects them in an emotional negative way as well. It compounds the issues that they're going through.
Yep.
Because we know that most kids are starting to question and everything else around about the age of 12 years old, especially into their early teens and everything else. And we know that as far as girls in Australia go, just over 5% of all the girls between the age of 11 and 15 will attempt suicide. So that's 1 out of every 20 girls will attempt to commit suicide at those ages. I'm wondering how much of that sort of feedback and those expectations and everything else are impacting on them as well. And how much the boys' attitudes around the pornography, because it's not just 16 to 17-year-olds are getting their hands on this stuff. It's getting the younger kids all the time.
Yeah, it's very, very worrying. I think, it's about the quality of conversations that we're having. Yeah, we need to have them, but I saw a really fascinating documentary between a problem child and her parents, and it was based around sex. And what the psychologist did is that you got the child and the parents together, gave them 2 Barbie dolls, a Ken doll, and said, right, make some sexual positions. And it was incredibly awkward for a little bit, but after a while it just broke down some boundaries, and they were doing all sorts, and it was just normalizing the talk of sex. Because when you remove the taboo, the need to look for the more extreme versions doesn't become too naughty anymore. It doesn't become this pull, this seduction. And I think that's why it worked, because it normalized. And that's the kind of thing I'll be doing with my kids, is being very honest around sex, very honest about how I feel about their mother, really educating them so that they don't treat young girls. I mean, I've had so many friends in the past who have been sex addicts, and they've met women, they've treated them horrendously, and they have said to me, I grew up on this. This is how I got conditioned to treat women. And I want my boys to grow up being the man that women talk about beautifully, about the one that got away, this beautiful guy. I don't want them to be the guy who treats them badly, objectifies them, and scars them mentally and emotionally.
And does the same in the process.
Yeah. You were saying, Michael?
And does the same to himself in the process. Yeah.
Yeah. So how would you see over there in the States, how would you see this working? What sort of ideas would you have, Thomas?
Well, I love the phrase Henry used there, the quality of conversations. You guys talk, and I think, especially here in the States, we're so prudish about sex. It's such a silent subject. And I think here, porn exists in this context of silence. I think it's like the less we talk about it, the darker porn gets. And it's like these things work together. And I think, if we can bring this out into the open and we can have these conversations, and I think, especially as men, I think it's imperative and it's on our shoulders to have these conversations with the younger guys. I think anyone coming up, they need to see an example of not just guys saying like, oh, porn is bad. No, none of that. I don't want to talk about it. Sex. It has to be out in the open. What if they get the other example of like, hey, okay, I see the value. I see your attraction to porn. I get it. I understand it's sex. It is like a drug. It's a dopamine hit. I get it. But here's everything else physical intimacy can be. Here's what a relationship can be. Here's the context of physical intimacy as part of this rich, deep relationship. I'm going to be open and honest about that. And this is what a man does. He does talk like this. He does share his feelings about this. If we had, if I am that example of like a transparent man, now they have a counterexample. It's not just this sex act and it's just physical and exists in a vacuum. It's like, whoa, it could be 100 times more. I think they need to see that, and we need to talk about it, and we need to make that quote unquote part of the manly conversation. It has to be about feelings and intimacy and total honesty, as Henry said. They've got to see that, because if they don't have that, they only have the one thing, and sex gets like this small. It's just this little world they live in.
Yeah, we've got to be able to see how it's part of the everything else that goes on as well, how it all comes together. But there's so many men I know who are
that like it's okay for men to talk about sex and talk about intimacy and talk about vulnerability. As Henry said, the awkwardness of it, the whole gambit. Like that's also part of a male conversation.
That's right, and that's what you were getting at there before, Michael, was making sure it's not just talking about the act of sex, but taking it into the fuller context and the full interaction into all parts of your life with your partner. There was I remember talking to a friend of mine some time back, and he said, well, I put off the talk to my boys about about sex for a long time. And he said, I finally got around to it. And I said to the boys, it's time for us to have that talk. And his boys said to him, well, what would you like to know, Dad? And, bit of a laugh and everything else, but, it's funny at that point, but what would it have been if then the son had started talking about what he understood from those pornography videos and everything else, and not about what he knew about through relationships. But as you said before, if you've got a father who talks to his children about that, or his sons in particular about it, then when he has those conversations with his son, or his son sees the way he treats his partner, he learns. We learn more through what we do, observing other people's, than what they actually say to us. So the boys need to see that interaction between their parents, first of all, in the loving touch and everything else, the way they communicate and connect. So they see that intimacy of just natural life between them. So that when dad then has that conversation and go, right, well, if you're looking at that porn, you can see where that's going. Can you see any of these relationships that I have with your mother, the intimacy and everything else, the love and affection in any of that porn stuff? So you can see how that's going to take you the wrong way. If you want this sort of a lifestyle, then we need to have another look at what you're looking at and revalue it and see it in its true context.
Yeah.
But, it's something that each of us as fathers need to do. But there's a lot of fathers out there who are nervous about that. There's a lot of fathers who are just trying to get time with their kids to start with. They don't want to, they don't see them all week and they get them for a short period of time. And they don't want to go into long conversations about that because, I went to dad and we had a sex talk. I went to dad's place and we played baseball. We went swimming. We went, playing football and things like that. That's what they want to talk about. So we need to, I think, look at how do we take this as a community. As I say, it takes a community to raise a family. Well, maybe we should really take that on board and start putting programs together where we have men that have that full understanding, like you were talking about, Henry, and also Michael, in making sure that the men who are talking about it are balanced, who look at the bigger context, not just talking about sex, but talk about the intimacy, bring the girls into it so they have conversations where they learn from each other about how to respect each other. How much would that go to setting both the boys and the girls up for better relationships when they find a partner, having better expectations of their partner, and then having a more lasting relationship? How does that then affect domestic violence and things like that? It's got to have a positive impact on reducing that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it certainly would. And one of the things that we know about porn and in relation to porn addiction as well, is that what people are actually searching for when they are watching porn is they're searching for some kind of connection within themselves, okay? And one of the things I think that needs to be part of this education is to explain and to bring to the awareness of these young people the fact that our primary drive as human beings is that need for connection with another human being or with other human beings, and that we can find that connection in much more healthy ways instead of where people are getting it from now.
That's it. And by the way, I love the way we move around in the room there when we lose connections. It's one of the things we've had to get used to with doing Zoom calls around the world. There's always one location or another that's going to have dropouts and other problems with the internet. But it just shows how we persevere and we're so dedicated to making some changes, which is really great.
Just adapt.
Yeah. So who can we actually talk to? We usually look for who should be responsible for this. And I think, first of all, we should take personal responsibility. As I say, when you point a finger at somebody, there's three fingers pointing back. So we have to take responsibility ourselves as men, wherever possible, with our children and everything else. If we're lucky enough to be in a loving relationship, we've got a better chance of being able to do it. If we're separated, divorced and everything else, it becomes a bit difficult. But if we're fathers, we need to do something like that. But then as men, how can we work together then to help other families, help other boys?
I think a bit of education around how to have those conversations. If we are talking about having those quality conversations, then we need to educate people on where and how to have them, how they go. And, Alan, you said, if a father's got their kids for, a few days within a month, then he needs to feel okay with how to have that conversation and communicate it from a place of love and like, you're my son, I want the best for you. And like, boys love guidance. I think, well, at least somewhere in my growing up, I always wanted a level of guidance that I didn't get. And especially around sex, I would have loved that guidance. And to educate each other, it could be as simple and as bare bones as if you need to have a conversation with your son about sex, then let's talk about it together. And then maybe you can go into it a little bit prepared and a little bit rooted in actually what you want the outcome to be. Because if you focus on the outcome, then the conversation will just be getting from A to B. And the awkwardness would be removed. And it's that awkwardness and not knowing how to do it, which I think is holding a lot of people back.
Yeah, no, it's very true. And that it's, as I said, with men out there who aren't really connected to any other people, we need to be putting things in place where they can connect. They can have those conversations. Because you're right that, it's like helicopter parenting. When you take away the boundaries from the kids, they get lost. Every child wants a boundary. They like to know if I'm going to belong, I need to know where I belong. And you need boundaries around that so they can actually find a position where they actually sit, where that belonging is. So to be able to put those boundaries in place correctly for them. And boys will always respond positively. And especially when you've got a couple of men talking and the boys are listening in, because then they hear it as being an adult conversation that every boy wants to be a man. So it helps them to connect on that level even better again.
And it would be in that same context, it'd be very, very, I believe it would be very powerful to have, a couple of men and a couple of women educating a class of kids, whether they're, a mix of boys and girls, on what's cool and what's not cool, what's acceptable and what's respectful behaviour and what isn't. And when boys are hearing that from women and girls are hearing that from men, and they see some really fine, good examples standing in front of them of what it is to be a woman and what it is to be a man, that's the beginning of the education process. Just seeing that example right in front of them, and those adults are actually a cohesive unit, and the same message is coming across as well. And in answer to your question, who takes responsibility? I believe it's the responsibility of the collective. It's a collective responsibility. It's parents, it's aunties and uncles, it's clergy, it's teachers, it's just everybody. And we all need to be working together, because the porn industry is massive and it is all-encompassing. And you can do a simple search, and kids do a simple search on on Google for something, and results will come up, unintended results will come up. So, yeah, I believe that there needs to be a lot more education surrounding internet security for kids.
Yeah, well, you're even right with Facebook, because at least every day, at least once, and sometimes 3 or 4 times, I'll get a friend request. It'll usually be a young woman. I'll have a quick look at the face. Now I've got to the stage, I don't even open it up, because all I've got in front of me then is a video. They're showing all the explicit sites, and I couldn't be bothered. So it's everywhere. And Facebook is not doing anything about it. But, you put up some posts about your men's groups and things like that, and they'll object to that. And 5 minutes later, you're getting this sort of stuff coming through as a friend request. So it's there. And as you said, I know that, when people were downloading software and there used to be codes that you could break into the software, they used to call it a crack code. So if you put in even the software's name and you put in crack code, quite often it went to a porn site because of the word crack. And it's, there's that much of it out there. It's the biggest industry on the planet. So, and it's the one that's going to destroy our boys if it's just left to control. So as you said, it is a collective. We all need to be involved in that. But there's a lot of men out there who would go, where do I start? I already feel emasculated, separated from the family and everything else. Here I am going to tell my son about what it is to be a man, and I don't feel like one myself.
Yeah.
So it really goes even a lot further again. It's back to the toxic masculinity. It's back to all the other areas that we've been talking about. It's just not one thing that we can work on. It's all the stuff together that we need to be looking at. That's my belief anyway.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And there's also, there's another, we're talking about fathers seeing their children once a fortnight for a weekend, for instance. And then, there's a bit of hesitancy for dads. I've been in this position before where there's a bit of hesitancy in terms of the conversations that you choose to have with your children, knowing full well that then your children will go home to their mother and say, "Oh, Dad, talk to us about this." And then what does that what does that bring up then in terms of consequences and repercussions when that discussion or the subject or the topic of that discussion is brought up out of context?
That's it.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff. Like, it's just a massive subject. Really.
It definitely is, because if your partner and that has got a lot of anger towards you, then, yep, you're trying to do the right thing, but that can be taken out of context, because quite often both men and women use their children as weapons against each other.
Yep.
So they take the opportunity to be able to do that, which if they only realise they're actually the biggest victims in all of that are their children. Can't use them as weapons.
Yep.
I was very lucky. I raised 3 boys on my own. Their mother only had them, was every second weekend at one stage. And then, but one of the things was never bagging her. It was having those conversations with my boys. And then for them to actually see not only me talking about stuff, but the way I treated women as well. And I'd had a lot of women in my life who were around at the time, because I wanted the boys to have that balanced life of growing up. Their mother may not have been there, to have other women around and to see how they were treated. Because if they didn't, then that also meant that I had to build a relationship with my ex, to a respectful one, so the boys could learn from my example of how to treat their mother, so they would know how to treat other women. And so
that's the key. It's how we actually lead our boys, and they will look to us and our girls as well. So they will look to us as an example, as the leader. And how do we treat other people, and how do we manage expectations in our own lives and our own behaviour, etc., and we always lead by example.
That's it. Well, Dad's always going to be their son's first hero, and as far as their daughter's concerned, they're going to be their daughter's first love.
Yeah.
And people talk about Freud. Well, I don't think it was anything about sex. It was actually that emotional connection. The girls are looking at Dad to go, okay, what are men really like? What am I going to end up with in my life? If Dad's an arsehole, well, then no wonder so many girls think, well, that's what I'm up against. Well, that's what I can expect to have. And when some kid comes along who's got no idea, they think that's normal. And then as they grow up, get more mature and experienced and talking to other women, they realise that was totally wrong. And now we've got broken relationships. But we've still got boys. And manhood has got nothing to do with age, in my view. We're all boys all the way through, but we take a certain point where we decide to behave in a different way, and that's when we become a man. That could be at 16, 14, it could be at 85. And that's the one thing. It's how we actually handle ourselves that actually impacts on everybody else, and that's what we need to be starting to look at, I think.
Yep, totally agree, Alan. Totally agree.
So any more thoughts or what would you say to the men who are listening to this, who may be going, well, where do I go to from here? It's all right for these guys to talk about it. They've had some experience with it or whatever. What advice would you have to them, or what sort of comments could you make that may make it easier for them to take the next step with their own sons?
I'd say be ready to have a very frank and open conversation, but root it from your experience and your thoughts and your feelings. So communicate your feelings primarily first, and be very real, very supportive, and acknowledge that it's okay to not be okay, and then it's okay to not feel like you have all the answers, and it's okay to feel under this huge amount of stress of being a boy. And what the fuck does it mean? And all this identity crisis that's going on. It's like, that's okay. What's being presented here, it's not the answer, but I have some answers which are more real and of more use to you. So I'd really want to have that conversation with you. You're my son.
And I think it is important, as you said, showing your vulnerability on that, because if you're your son's hero and he can see that you don't have all the answers, it takes the pressure off him to have to be, to fit that idol that he thinks you are.
Yeah. So
we can actually create that connection where then you can explore together. And, let's go out and look at this. Let's go and talk to other men. And you can create, as you were saying, Michael, bring the community, the collective together and get that support.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
I think just building on what Henry said, I think it's also important for us men to start feeling a bit more comfortable within that uncomfortable place of having this discussion with our boys and our girls as well. And I think it's an incredibly valuable discussion to have. And if we think about the awkwardness that we felt in our sex education class at school, because I remember that too, the awkwardness that we felt, our children will feel that and as well. And we might feel that to a certain extent too. So I think it's a matter of, you know, as adults and as men, we have encountered so much in life. We've experienced uncomfortable situations and we've come through them and we're still alive and we're still okay. So that's just one more little uncomfortable situation that when we think about the greater good, and the greater good is helping to raise healthy boys who will turn into healthy men. And if that's not motivation enough for us to have an uncomfortable, what may feel like an uncomfortable conversation initially, then I don't know what is motivation, because we think about the struggles that we went through in terms of just building that identity surrounding what does sex mean to us and what is it, you know, how do we differentiate what porn tells us versus real life, and the difficulty that we faced sometimes around that, and trying to help our sons and our daughters to not have to deal with that. I mean, that's enough motivation for me.
That's it. And at the end of it, the day when you're finished, that the response you'll get back from your kids, both your sons and your daughters, talking about how that had made their life so much easier and less stressful, with more understanding of where they were heading, that is a bonus that comes on top. It's the icing on the cake again, which really adds to it. How about yourself, Thomas?
Well, I was thinking about, you know, I never got that conversation from my dad. I never had the birds and the bees conversation. And I think it was because, it made him uncomfortable. And he wanted to be there for the fun stuff. And not the hard, difficult, awkward conversations. And I think I can see the effect that had in my life. So I would advise anyone in the same situation to think about that. Like, what this decision you made to not embrace this moment, this connection, this possible connection you could have with your son, because it doesn't feel comfortable to you, is going to affect him, could potentially affect him the rest of his life. So I say drop the shame and the guilt, and drop the fear of making mistakes, and drop the fear of being uncomfortable, as we said, and embrace that role that you play in a young person's life, your son's life, your daughter's life. I mean, I think it's going to be a new discovery. It's going to be a new moment for you. You're going to find a new depth of yourself, and you're going to, you know, change their life.
That's it. Well, that's all.
I would really advise them to think about, like, what's going to happen if you don't do that. Who's going to have that conversation with them, if anyone?
Who wants to clean up the mess later on? Well, nobody does. So if we're able to circumvent that with just feeling a little bit uneasy, but knowing that our sons just feel just as uneasy, if not more so, because they have no idea of what's to follow and everything else. At least we've lived through a few things. But imagine what they're wondering and everything else, and how their confusion is hitting them every day. Well, I don't think I'd need to say to the men, if you love your child, well, you know, you just naturally do it because you do. We know they do. And one of the things I'd like to do, as we're closing off on this, is that we've got quite a few women in the group. And for the ladies who are out there, I've really been pleased as well, because I've had some messages sent through on Messenger from some of the women who are in the group going, wow, we're loving this. We're passionate, you know, we're really fantastic about the way the men are passionate about expressing themselves, being vulnerable. And you guys have blown me away, because every time I say I'm going to have another panel discussion, it's like, well, everybody's rushing in the door to get into it. So it's showing that you've got so much to share. And I'd love the feedback from the women, especially on this particular talk, because we're now talking about not just with our sons, but with our daughters as well. So I'd love to hear from the women what discussions they would like to hear from their husbands. Now, they would like to have with their husbands to start with, how they can work together on that, how they can work with both their sons and their daughters. So, you know, I've always wanted to get more interaction. We've had the one-on-one conversations, which have been fantastic, hearing about the stories and hearing about the past and showing that vulnerability. So we've shown other men that it's okay. And so it's allowed them to actually move forward as well. We've had these panel discussions where we're getting into more meaty conversations. It's time to now start hearing from the ladies as well. I love it that you've respected the men so much and sat back and just listened to the conversations. And I know how much they've been wanting to say things because I'm the one getting the personal messages about how they're loving it. So, ladies, let's hear from you as well. Give us some ideas. You know, we're here trying to learn ourselves. We're trying to work together and guide each other and see where we can go. Getting some input from the women, because it's not just a men's group. This was a campfire for men to start with, to bring the boys through, and then grow into a community or global village. And a global village has both men and women in it, boys and girls as well. So love to hear your comments as well. But, gentlemen, well, every time we get together, I glance at the clock every now and then, and that's minute hand just going so fast.
It flies by.
Yeah, well, I can sit here and talk all day with you guys and that because there's so much that we've got in common. There's so many good ideas. And every time we have these conversations, why am I running this thing? So I can learn a hell of a lot.
Yes.
So I appreciate you all being here. Thanks very much.
No worries, Alan. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
And
Thanks,
everybody
guys.
who's listening, thank you for listening in. Tell your friends about it. Tell them what we're trying to do here. Get more people to come to the group and join in on the conversations. Thank you very much. Bye-bye for now.
Thanks, Helen.